Let's talk about the easiest way to make zoom animations in DaVinci Resolve. There's a few different types of zooms. We have the standard zoom where it zooms in and holds that position, one where it takes the zoomed in view and then pans it, and another that combines both of those, taking a zoomed in view, zooming even more, and then panning as well, or zooming out and panning as well. There's also a continuous zoom where it applies the zoom over a long period of time instead of just a short in and out. So let me show you two tools from the editor collection, WippZoom and WippPivot. WippZoom is available for free in editor collection lite, so you can try that out, link down below. And then the full version comes with more than 20 other powerful edit page tools just like these, and we'll talk more about that at the end. And here's a quick comparison showing me create the same animation, one using a transform mode with keyframes and the other one using the WippZoom and WippPivot tools. If you currently do all of your animations on the edit page, those take even longer if you want to get a good result. You can see it only took me 48 seconds to create the animation with WippZoom and WippPivot, and it took me more than twice as long when doing it manually. We have a clear winner when it comes to building it alone. Plus, WippZoom and WippPivot have real-time motion blur. Alright, inside of DaVinci Resolve, the example footage we're going to be working today is some Inception level stuff here. We have DaVinci Resolve working with WippZoom and WippPivot, and then that is editing a video inside of DaVinci Resolve with another tool that we're going to talk about today. So this is going to be fun. But WippZoom and WippPivot both work as either an effect or a generator. So let me show you the difference. So in effect, if we come to the effects library under effects, we can drag down WippZoom, and this is going to apply it to the clip itself. So it's going to have a zoom animation on the clip. In the inspector, I can come to effects and I can delete that right there. I'm going to come to the effects library and grab a generator version. What this is going to do is show up above the clip, and we can make this as long as we want. So if we only want the zoom to take place on a portion of the clip, the generator version is going to work really good for that because it's just going to take place here, and at the end it's going to zoom out. So we can make this as long as we want or as short as we want, and we can extend this over multiple clips instead of just keeping it to that one clip. So a lot of the times I work with WippZoom because it also has another feature when working with WippPivot. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's zoom in here. So when I hit play, it's just going to take a zoomed out view, it's going to zoom it in, it's going to wait there, and then at the end it's going to zoom back out. So if we click on the tool in the inspector, we can get access to all of the controls. And a nice thing to know about, down in the bottom left, if you hit this drop down menu, you can turn on Fusion Overlay. So that means we have this little crosshair in here. So if I drag this, it's going to change the pivot point. So just with the on-screen controls, I can change where it's actually going to zoom into. So if I put that up in the top right, when I hit play, it's just going to zoom into that top right portion. So it's super easy to change where that's going to zoom to. Then inside the inspector, I can change stuff like the start size as well as the end size. So I can have it zoom in more, or at the beginning, I could have it start zoomed in a little bit. Let's set this end size to be about 2, just because that's a little bit more reasonable. So now it zooms into this set portion. This next control, just to show you real quick, is the continued zoom. So when I drag this up, it's just going to add a little bit of a continued zoom motion, either zooming in or zooming out if you make the value negative. So now what it does is it zooms in, it's just going to keep moving just a very little bit, and then at the end, it's going to zoom back out to the resting size. Another nice thing is this swap start and end. So it's just going to switch those values around, so that way it's going to zoom out instead of zooming in. The continued zoom stays the same, so you can change that if you need it. Alright, swapping those back, let's skip all the way down here to the anim engine. This one customizes how that zoom is actually applied. So first up, we have frames or seconds. This just changes how you actually animate it. So usually I like to work in seconds just because that works better, but you can do frames if you'd like as well. The first two checkboxes allow us to choose when it actually animates. So if I turn off the in animation, it's going to start animated in. It's still going to have that continued zoom, but then at the end, it's going to animate out. And you can flip that around as well. So you can have it animate in, but not animate out, or just have it have no animations at all and just use that little continued zoom. I'll show you a different way to do that in just a minute. But with those selected, we can change the animation length. So by default, it takes 1 second. If you want a fast zoom, you can just do 0.5. That'll take half a second for it to get to the end size, or for a long zoom, you can do 2 seconds, or as long as you want. We even have the option to unlink the animations. So that means the first animation I could have take 2 seconds, and the out animation could take half a second. So what's going to do, it's going to zoom in, and then it's going to wait, and then at the end, it's going to have a really quick zoom out animation. Depending on the clip too, you might want it to take 1 second to start animating. So that's what that anim offset is as well. Typically, you're not going to use the offset values when working with the generator version, because you can just shift this clip back and forth or just trim it down to make it a little bit shorter to change when it actually starts. You would mostly use that when you're working with the effect version, when you can't actually change the length of the effect. So you would use the anim offset, so that way it could start 10 seconds into the clip or whatever you want to do. Let's set this animation back to be linked, so that way they're both linked to this one control. And just to show you, if I make this too long, it's going to say error animation too long. So you either have to turn one of the animations off, make the clip a little bit longer so that way there's enough time for the animation, or just make the animation length shorter. Down here at the bottom, we can also change the easing. So you can change between any of these values. So let's say you do quad and expo. When I hit play, it's going to change that easing curve just a little bit. And if you want, you can even set this to be custom. So you can draw your own curve that it's going to take, so you can have it start really fast and then slow down at the end, just like so. And then last, we have this motion blur control. And the nice thing about this is this works in real time. So when I add that to it and when I hit play, I'm just going to pause it in the middle here. You can see we have a really nice looking motion blur that just applies right away. This saves so much time in rendering and gives you a really good looking result. This will also apply to the out animation automatically. One more thing to note, if we come to this blur tab, we can enable a blur. So that means in the middle, it's going to kind of come out of focus a little bit, and you can change the intensity with the slider here. I'm going to disable that, and under the controls tab, let's switch this over to be the continuous mode. Now, instead of having one animation at the beginning and end, it's going to have the animation over the entire clip. So when I hit play, it's going to start at the start size, and then once it gets to the end size, it's going to stop. This also reveals a new mode, so we can set this to be speed. And what this does is you can set a start size as well as a pivot, and then just set a continued zoom speed. So what this allows is you to have the exact same constant speed no matter how long the clip is. So if I change this to make it really long, it's still going to be going at the exact same speed. So if you're working with a lot of clips that are different lengths, this is a great option to do because that way you have the same speed without having to manually try and match that up. So there is a lot of really cool stuff. Let me delete this tool, and now let's talk about doing the zooms in and then also moving that zoom to a different location. I'm going to start fresh with a new version of WippZoom. So we're going to zoom in, let's say down in the bottom left corner, and then in the inspector, what we want to do is turn off the out animation because we do not want it to come back out to the full screen at the end. So it zooms in and it's just going to hold there until the end of the clip. Now I'm going to grab the generator version of WippPivot. So this only works with the generator versions of the clips. With this pivot, I want to make sure it's at least touching the WippZoom, and I'm actually going to bring this closer so that way it's closer to the beginning animation. When I hit play, it's going to zoom in to a spot and then it's going to snap to a different spot and then pan. What we need to do is tell WippPivot some of the controls that are inside of WippZoom. And the nice thing is this is super easy. In the inspector of WippPivot, we can just hit this match button. And if you watch the start pivot, what it's going to do is grab the values from WippZoom. So the start pivot now matches the pivot inside of WippZoom, and then the size in WippPivot also matches the size in WippZoom. What that means is we're going to have a seamless transition. So when I hit play here, it's going to take the WippZoom version and then it's going to move it to a different spot on the screen. WippPivot has a lot of the same controls. We have the start pivot, the end pivot, the size. We also have that match button, the swap, so we can switch it around, and then unlink size. What this allows us to do is also animate the size during that pivot. So it's going to make sure 1.5, that needs to be the same as a version in WippZoom. But when we hit play, it's also going to be able to zoom in a little bit more on that second location. So it's going to start wide and at the start pivot, and then it's going to zoom in to the top corner. If you're just going to keep the size length, you can just hit link size, so that way you don't need to be changing multiple controls. Then for the animation engine, we have all of those same controls down below. So we have the motion blur, we have the in and out checkboxes, and a lot of times when I set this up, I just turn off the out animation right away because I don't want this to, if the out animation's on, it just pans back down to that bottom corner. I don't want that to happen, so I'm just going to turn off the out animation. Then to zoom this back out, what I usually do is grab another version of WippZoom. I'll just put this wherever I want that to start. Hit this match button and make sure the end size is set to be 1, so that way it zooms all the way out. Now it's going to zoom back out to the full view, and in WippZoom, I want to make sure this out animation is turned off, so that way it just ends, it stays there, it works great. To point out real quick before I show you a really nice trick, inside of WippPivot, if I grab a new version of this, we also have the continuous mode. So that means we can have a start pivot and then a end pivot off at the end. So when I hit play, that's just going to pan that all the way up to the top corner over the duration of the clip. It's going to work pretty much the same as the continuous mode inside of WippZoom. Okay, so there's one other really cool thing that we can do with this. Recently, I released a tool called WippReMacro that allows you to save your own version of all of these tools. And that one is free, so even if you're using Editor Collection Lite, you can use this tool. If you noticed, in each one of these, I went through and changed the out animation. I turned that off because I don't want it. That gets really repetitive if you have to do 20 or 30 zooms throughout a project, or if you always change the animation length to be half a second or 1 second long. So what we can do is build our own version of these tools. So with WippZoom, I'm going to drag this down and we're going to build our own version. So let's say every time it zooms in, you don't want there to be an out animation. We can turn that off. And maybe you always want the animation to take 1.5 seconds and have a little bit of motion blur. It's not that bad applying it, but again, if you have to do it multiple times throughout a project, it gets to be a bit annoying. What we can do now is switch switch over to the Fusion page. So we can just hit this Go to Fusion button up in the inspector, and you don't need to know much about Fusion for this. All you need to do is come down and copy this WippZoom node. So Control C or Command C, and then you can come up to Workspace, come down to Scripts, WippRe Macro, and it's going to open this pop-up. You got to make sure that's installed first. The first thing is we can add in a custom tool name. So we're going to call this WippZoom, and then we're going to do in, and then we're going to do 1.5. You can even select a preview image, so that way there's a little thumbnail so you can have an icon or something so it's easy to find. Then you would hit save, and you'd want to save this in the generators folder, and I would save it under WIP templates and custom tools, and then you would want to save this in here. So you can see I already have a WippZoom in 1.5, so I'm not going to overwrite that. I'm just going to hit cancel, and if we come back to the edit page, those will appear right inside of your effects library. Then when I drag this down to the timeline, it's already going to have all of those controls selected. So it's going to have the in animation on, the out animation off, and the animation length at 1.5. So just like that, you can make your own versions of the tool, so that way it's drag and drop, hit that match button, change where it's going to zoom into, and you're good to go. It's super fast to use these tools. So if you're still on the fence about the editor collection, check out the free version down below, try out this WippZoom tool, but just using WippZoom and WippPivot together is usually more than enough for the pack to pay for itself if you do a lot of these animations when you're editing. An editor collection has more than 20 edit page tools, so there's a ton of stuff that this pack can do, so learn more down at the link below. It is a great resource for anyone using DaVinci Resolve. If you guys have any questions or feedback about the tool, let me know down in the comments below, and have a great day.